the night John Wayne's heart spoke on Johnny Carson's show. The studio lights were bright that night, but when John Wayne walked onto the stage, something about the room suddenly felt different. The audience erupted in applause. There stood the Duke, the towering symbol of American courage, the man millions had watched ride across dusty western landscapes, face danger without fear, and walk away with that unforgettable slow, confident stride. But tonight, beneath the famous cowboy image, there was simply a man. Johnny Carson smiled as Wayne took his seat. The conversation began with the familiar Carson humor. They talked about Hollywood, Western movies, old friends, and the stories that had made Wayne a legend. The audience laughed. Wayne laughed too. But then Carson asked a quieter question. What keeps you going after all these years? For a moment, Wayne didn't answer. He looked down. The studio became strangely silent. The Duke had spent decades playing men who never showed weakness. On screen, he could stare down an outlaw, survive a gunfight, or ride into the sunset without looking back. But sitting beside Carson, he didn't need to play a character. He spoke about getting older. He spoke about the people he had lost. And he spoke about how quickly a man's life can pass. Carson listened carefully. There was no interruption, no joke. Just respect. Wayne's voice became softer as he remembered the early days of his career. The long hours, the difficult films, the friendships, and the people who had helped him become the man America knew as John Wayne. Then came the thought that seemed to touch everyone in the room. A man's greatest success, Wayne suggested, wasn't how famous he became. It was the people who remembered him with love. Carson looked at him. The two men had spent years entertaining America, but for a moment, neither seemed interested in entertaining anyone. They were simply two men talking about life. Wayne smiled. That famous smile. But behind it was something deeper, a lifetime of memories. The audience watched quietly. Somewhere behind the cameras, people who had grown up watching John Wayne realized they weren't just watching a movie star anymore. They were watching time itself. The Duke had become part of their childhoods. He had been there in Western theaters, on television screens, in family living rooms, and in countless American memories. And now, sitting under the bright lights beside Johnny Carson, he seemed almost aware that no man can outrun time. The conversation eventually returned to laughter. Wayne made a joke. Carson laughed. The audience laughed with them. For a few seconds, the heaviness disappeared. But the feeling remained. When the interview moved on, Wayne leaned back in his chair and looked toward Carson with quiet appreciation. There was no grand speech. No dramatic goodbye. Just a simple moment between two legends. And perhaps that was what made it so powerful. John Wayne had spent his entire career teaching audiences what courage looked like. But that night, courage looked different. It wasn't a cowboy riding into danger. It wasn't a gunfight. It wasn't a fearless hero standing against impossible odds. It was an aging man sitting beneath television lights, remembering his life and allowing the world to see the human being behind the legend. Johnny Carson gave him the space to do that. And the audience gave him something even more valuable. Silence. The kind of silence that says, "We are listening." Years later, people would remember John Wayne for his movies, his voice, his walk, and the characters he played. But moments like this remind us that behind every legend is a human heart. A heart that remembers. A heart that hurts. A heart that loves. And eventually, a heart that must say goodbye. That night on Johnny Carson's stage, John Wayne didn't need a horse, a cowboy hat, or a western sunset to be the Duke. He simply had to sit there and be John Wayne. And for millions who loved him, that was more than enough. because legends may live forever on the screen, but it is the human moments that keep them alive in our hearts. Red.